Hello, everybody. Welcome to MEERTALK. My name is Kaeza Fern, and I'm the Director of Communications at MEER. We are very glad to be getting together for another MEERTALK, and today we're going to be hearing from Paul Beckwith. Then we'll take questions from people in the MEER community, and after that, we'll open it up to questions from you in our audience. MEER is expanding its projects in both India and Africa, and if you'd like to contribute toward our efforts to cool the planet, we do appreciate every single donation. You can go to meer.org/donate, and we thank you for your contributions. You could also write to info@meer.org to be in touch. So let me tell you about our guest speaker. Paul Beckwith is a part-time professor in climatology and a climate system scientist. He has an engineering and physics background with a varied experience base, including product management and organization, teaching, and research. You probably know him, or you might know him from YouTube, where he has done literally thousands of videos. Paul, we're so glad to have you. And if anybody has any questions while Paul's presenting, you can send them to co-host Barbara in the chat. Yeah, thrilled to have you here today, Paul, and we're eager to hear what you are going to share.
Yes, well, thank you for inviting me and having me, speak, on a MEERTALK. So the topic today is global tipping points, and there's a sort of very extensive, detailed document that came out from the University of Exeter. It came out and was released for the previous climate conference, COP, Conference of the Parties, last year in Dubai. That's sort of the time frame at which it came out. And the title of the report is Global Tipping Points 2023. And Tim Lenton is the main instigator behind the report. You might know him from some global tipping point papers back as far as like 2012, I believe. And they talk about, they're trying to inform people, that we don't, climate change, we tend to think of it as being sort of a linear thing. It gets hotter, we need to adapt, we need to try to reduce the warming. But the problem is that there's all of these different tipping elements of the climate system. Most obviously, or most well known, are probably the tipping of the Amazon rainforest. So we could reach a point where the Amazon rainforest just doesn't get enough moisture, and it's too hot. And the forest, lots of the forest will burn, and it will not regrow as tropical rainforest. It would regrow as grassland, maybe the odd tree, so something like a savanna. So the carbon sink would be lost. So we would tip in from one state to another state. Other terms for tipping points are regime change or critical transitions. The best example of a tipping point I like is, water. As you cool down water and get closer and closer to zero, it's still water. Eventually you reach that magic point where there's a phase transition and it becomes ice. And it's a very, very abrupt transition. You could be 0.00001 degrees Celsius or 32.00 whatever Fahrenheit, and it's still water. But you reach that, you just go down that little bit. So a very small change can lead to a very large impact on a system. So this is what we talk about. We talk about crossing thresholds. The problem in the climate system is that many of these tipping points are not reversible, say. So you have something called hysteresis or lag in the system. So perhaps what I call the mother of all tipping points, if you like, is the ocean current system. Specifically the AMOC. People talk about the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. So you get warm water, think of the Gulf Stream moving north and east across to Europe, bringing lots of heat. And then when it reaches into the Arctic, there's regions near borders with ice, typically, where the water gets colder and the ice is forming, so the salt is rejected, so the water density goes up. and then that water sinks to the ocean floor and then moves southward. And we have this whole global ocean circulation system that is driven by a combination of temperature differences and salinity, salt. So it's called the thermo for heat, haline circulation, THC, haline being the salty part. So it's driven by the density of the water, dependent on temperature and salinity. So this whole system is slowing down measurably. And in fact, I've often talked about the sea ice in the Arctic, the idea that we could lose all of the sea ice, not just in the summer, but throughout winters, as tipping points. And, in Antarctica, the ocean currents are behaving very strangely. They've slowed down significantly as well. So if this whole system of ocean currents actually stops, at least rewires in the Northern Hemisphere, if we cooled the planet back down, it's not like we could just restart it. It's probably stuck in that state for hundreds of years. Coral reefs are a huge tipping point, very vital for marine life in the oceans, because about 25% of all fish in the ocean spend part of their life cycle, usually juvenile stages, on coral reefs. And the water is just too warm. These things are dying off. Now, they could reform over hundreds of thousands of years, but that's basically, they're gone for human timescales. So there's all of these different tipping points in the climate system that are very bad, and then there's also the dangers of them cascading. So one thing, like I call the ocean, the AMOC and the ocean currents, sort of the mother of all tipping points, because there's so many different connections to other systems that can tip. So it's not, you can get like a domino effect or a cascading effect. And, in our language, we have jargon, which, is basically tipping points. Like the straw that broke the camel's back, for example, is a good one, right? I mean, that's a sort of a metaphor that, you pass a situation or a threshold where you make a very, very small change and it changes the entire system rapidly. So there's a lot of these non-linearities in the climate system. Now, I'm going to digress a little bit before I get into some more details of this report. I mean, but first I'll say the key thing is, when we talk about feedbacks in the climate system, the jargon is that a negative feedback is a feedback which slows down change in the system. It's like a braking feedback. It's a good thing, right? But it's called a negative feedback. So this is very confusing to a lot of people. Meanwhile, a positive feedback in the climate system, which we have fewer of than negative feedbacks, is something that would slow down. A positive feedback accelerates a change. So it's what you don't want in the climate system, yet positive is the connotation that it's good. So that's confusing. That's the terminology, scientific terminology in tipping points. This paper, this article on global tipping points reverses that. So a positive global tipping point is a good thing that slows down climate and maybe prevents tipping. So some examples, of course, are solar panels, wind, electric cars, more and more humans understand the climate issue, so politicians take action, divesting from fossil fuels, all of these things that try to maintain a stable climate. Those would be positive global tipping point. Governance is a big part of it. There's a whole chapter in this report on governance, whereas the negative tipping points are the things that we don't want to happen, like loss of the Amazon rainforest and the huge carbon sink, slowing down of ocean currents enough so that the huge carbon sink in the southern hemisphere weakens. So there's less carbon absorbed in the ocean system. There's more in the atmosphere and accelerated warming. So that's some of the terminology. Now, I was lucky enough to attend the Ottawa International Writers Festival just yesterday. And I'm going to talk about briefly just a couple books. So there's this book here. It's called Intervention Earth by Gwynne Dyer, Life saving ideas from the world's climate engineers. It's actually, he said the title was a bit weird. The author, the publisher insisted on saying climate engineers, but he interviewed about 100 different scientists with all different viewpoints on so-called geoengineering ideas. The book is quite good. It talks about sort of what's being done on carbon dioxide removal studies. I've talked about the three-legged bar stool where, we have to slash fossil fuel emissions, need to remove carbon and CO2 from the atmosphere. And we also need to, really study and probably deploy what is called solar radiation management technologies. Now, that name sounds like an accountant came up with that name, as he was talking about in the book, right? It's ideas like marine cloud brightening, sulfur aerosol injection into the stratosphere is the biggest one. And it's the biggest one because it's probably very effective. It would probably cool quite significantly because that's what happens when large volcanoes go off and put sulfur up into the stratosphere. But I actually think we should get rid of that terminology SRM, and we should use SOS. And SOS stands for solar optimizing solutions or solar optimizing systems. The idea is that, we have made Earth changes in the Earth system so that there's more sunlight being absorbed at the surface of the Earth, and that's causing tremendous amounts of heating. There's heat being trapped in the Earth system, and this is unplanned. This is from our fossil fuel burning. Another thing that has greatly ramped up the heat recently is the removal of sulfur from shipping fuels, according to James Hansen's recent work, which is being corroborated by some other groups now. So the International Maritime Organization put restrictions to remove sulfur from 3.5% content levels to 0.5%. So they reduced sulfur by a factor of 7 in 2020 in shipping fuels. And there was a reduction down to the 3.5% from something like 9 or 10% in 2015. So there's less sulfur in the air over oceans, and sulfur forms sulfur dioxide, which acts as a cloud condensation nuclei. There's more clouds, low-level clouds over the oceans when there's sulfur in the shipping fuels. A lot of those clouds result from that, and we've had those for years and years, and they've blocked sunlight. Now that there's much less sulfur, the heating has taken off. So Hansen shows that up until about 2010, the global average temperature was increasing 0.18 degrees Celsius per decade. And since 2010, it's been increasing somewhere between 0.27 and 0.36 degrees Celsius per decade. So the global warming rate per decade has increased by 50 to 100%. Okay, it's gone up 1.5 to 2 times faster. And the oceans, as we know, have been on a tear in terms of temperatures, being as high as 4 or 5 standard deviations warmer than normal. And over the oceans, there's very few particles. As you can imagine, most particle generation is from industry and humans on land, through our what we do every day in our industrial processes. But over the oceans, it's pretty pristine. The air is pretty clear. So removing the sulfur from the shipping fuels removes it from the air over the ocean. So the warming is greatly accelerated. Now, I should say that not everybody is on board with this. In fact, Michael Mann was talking at the Writers' Festival just yesterday, and I spoke to him a little bit about sulfur, and he just doesn't think Hansen is correct on that. But anyway, some of these positive global tipping points are going to require, solar modification techniques. I think it's just a matter of time. The world will not want to live going through a global food crisis that can result from accelerated warming, say within the next 5 or 10 years. We're going to start trying to deploy solar radiation management. Like I don't like that SOS. The SOS term, I think, is a much better term. So Michael Mann, this book, he came out with this book, I guess late last year. I haven't read it yet. I've read Gwynne Dyer's book, but this book is all about it's all about the Earth's past, like the five great extinctions, the changes in temperature in the Earth's past, and what we can gain from that. You know, can we get smarter knowing this on the way we deal with climate today? But you know, Michael Mann, of course, is still a very controversial figure. Lots of people think that he's just too conservative. He represents kind of the mainstream science, and which he does. He thinks that models account for most of what we're seeing, and he doesn't really. He was in public debates recently with Hansen about Hansen's recent papers and work on sulfur in particular, and Michael Mann. I think people have the impression, you know, even people that are well informed in the climate area, probably most of you are in that sort of category. You know, you have bad things to think about Mann because he represents sort of the mainstream. He's saying that climate models represent the system well. He's a really nice guy in person when you chat with him. I met him at an AGU, American Geophysical Union conference, just before COVID in New Orleans. I went there instead of one of the COPs that year, and we had good discussions and so on. So, you know, I might, you know, maybe I could get him to appear on a MEERTALK or on my own on the channel I work with, the Climate Emergency Forum channel, or Facing Future. I mean, I think he's amenable to that sort of thing. So the other speaker, another speaker yesterday, I got his book. I'm a sucker for buying books. You know, Wade Davis, Beneath the Surface of Things. So he's an anthropologist. And so among his most notable, people may have heard of him from an article he wrote. It was called The Unraveling of America, first published in Rolling Stone, 5 million readers, 362 million social media impressions, sparked media interest in 23 nations, became the most influential essay of the era. So he writes, you know, essays, and he's written quite a bit about climate change. He thinks that the Earth is very, very resilient. And I tried to impress on him, well, yes, the Earth is resilient, but we're talking about humans maintaining their civilization and social order on the Earth, and that's going to be very difficult to do with the temperatures that are projected. And I just want to say that, you know, it's all fine and dandy reading all these serious books, but you need, in my case, you need the fluff, like Clive Cussler. You know, he died a number of years ago. There's still these books, Clive Cussler, and then the title. Well, his name is now part of the title just to trick the reader into, you know, continuing to buy his books. I mean, so anyway, you got to have a sort of a fluff book going on at the same time as all these other serious books. So I highly recommend Global Tipping Points. It goes into great detail on the things that I've mentioned, on the ocean current systems, on the jet streams becoming slower and wavier, and you know, on the ocean currents, the AMOC, on the Amazon rainforest, on boreal forests in general, because boreal forests, they call them taiga in Russia. Those forests are under great stress, as you know, from the much warmer temperatures and the changing rainfall precipitation patterns. Also from as it gets warmer in winters, you don't get a lot of the vermin killed, the pests like mountain pine beetle, for example, emerald ash borer, those things that are really stressing the forest and killing lots of trees, making them prone to wildfires in those regions, are becoming a huge issue. As you know, from in Canada last year, we had something like, you know, between 18 and 20 million hectares of forest burned, whereas in a typical year, it might be about 4 hectares or 5 hectares. So, you know, the forest, the wildfires that burned in Canada last year exceeded any previous year by a factor of 4 or maybe close to 5 times. And, you know, the smoke, of course, crossed North America and hit major US cities for a few days. So So everybody's sort of wondering, oh, what's going to happen with this particular winter? And I think you'll have that speaker of the book, John Balin, talking on the wildfires soon. There's lots of stress on agriculture and food systems globally, and there's risk that the jet stream sets up into this mode 5 or mode 6 configuration, where it simultaneously degrades our food growing regions in the northern hemisphere, and that would lead to global food shortages. So that is a big risk and sort of a weakness of human society. If you're looking at sort of mechanisms that will come into play, it's no good. It's no good saying we're all doomed. That's way too general a statement. In fact, somebody, who said we have about 10 years left. I think, 9 years have gone by. So, there's still, like, you can't put dates on this sort of thing. I mean, there is, and it really doesn't, it's sort of counterproductive because, part of human nature is to have hope, to try things. We've got to keep trying things. I mean, the MEER project is a perfect example. We could reach a tipping, like look at the temperatures that are ongoing right now in parts of Asia. Okay, it's not even summer yet, and we're getting record high temperatures across areas of, large parts of Asia. And in the urban areas, if you even if you have air conditioning, if the power goes off, you need passive ways to cool your region. So putting mirrors on rooftops is one way you can get huge, it's one thing that you can do. It's not that expensive. And, even if you have air conditioning, it will greatly reduce the cost and usage of that air conditioning, because you're sending the sun back away from your location. So it's crucial in urban areas, because of the urban heat island effect is making things a lot worse in large cities, and more people around the planet are migrating to cities, right? We're getting these huge mega cities. The solar industry, of course, is reaching a tipping point in terms of price. Same with wind, mostly offshore wind, right? When the price is lower than that of fossil fuels, then the only questions are, how close can you build the renewable sites to where the demand is? How resilient are they? What sort of infrastructure do you have to bring the power from where they are? If it's offshore wind, you have to bring the power to shore, then you have to bring it to cities. So what sort of infrastructure do you need? But we can build those types of systems extremely quickly, and they reached parity a few years ago with fossil fuel prices, and so we can do much better with those. So we're reached tipping points, but electric cars and battery technologies have greatly improved. So that's one of the biggest factors. But, we have to really think about what we want to do, because, the knee-jerk reaction, well, yeah, let's just replace global fleets of cars with electric cars. Well, no, there's about 1.5 billion cars on the planet right now. That's equivalent to the number of cattle and cows on the planet. What do we want to just have, replace those cars with electric? I mean, do we have enough materials to do that? Probably no. But the point is, I think the transportation could be greatly improved if people got over the idea of, we need to get rid of the idea of private car ownership, I think, is the bottom line. Think of it. Your car spends 95% of its time in the garage or in your driveway, not being used, right? For most people that are fortunate enough to own a car, right? So this is a huge waste, right? So if it was 90% or 95%, we could make do with 5 or 10% of the existing global car fleet, and those cars would be electric, rechargeable, running off batteries, and may or may not be full self-driving cars, and you basically just dial up the car and it comes to your house. Think of the money saved on rebuilding road infrastructure, wear and tear on roads. Think of the money, think of the space saved in on the planet, space that is parking lots and that is roads and the right. I mean, society would completely change, and you wouldn't have traffic jams anymore. So when you dial up to get a car, your car would be there right away, right? Traffic would be reduced on roads by 90 or 95%, right? So it's sort of like, sometimes it's good to kind of like put yourself off this planet in your mind. You're up in space somewhere, you're from another planet, you're looking down at this planet with all of its problems and troubles, and don't assume that anything has to be done a certain way, because it's always been done that way on our planet, right? You need to sort of expand your thinking, out of the box thinking or whatever, blue sky thinking, and say, what would we do if we were starting from scratch? If we didn't have this legacy of infrastructure, what would we do? So all of these sort of things fit into some of the positive global tipping points and positive ideas. But we don't have the luxury of time, unfortunately, because we're heading up against all of these thresholds of tipping points in the climate system. And we have better statistics now to actually scientifically measure a parameter in a system and actually get some foreknowledge of, is the system going to tip or not? And some of the statistics is, we can look at, if you look at, say, some curve, some parameter, there's generally, if the system's resilient, there's very high frequency fluctuations and noise in it. And as it trends up, if it crosses a threshold nearing a tipping point, the vibrational frequencies slow down. And you can determine that statistically by doing an autocorrelation with a lag, and determine that, hey, the autocorrelation is increasing, the system is becoming more brittle, if you like. The system is not as resilient. So not only is there a critical slowing down of the frequency of oscillation, but the amplitude of the swings gets larger and larger. And this is a good sign that the system may be about to tip. It's not definitive. It doesn't mean for sure that the system is going to tip, but there's there's 4 or 5 major climate systems that have tipping points where we're experiencing this critical slowing down, this increase in autocorrelation. We're getting very, very close to crossing these thresholds. And if you look at global, I had to laugh at Michael Mann yesterday, because he kept talking about 1.5 Celsius. Here's what we need to do to stay at 1.5. And, the old Paul maybe would have jumped up in the audience and said, we were at 1.5 for all of 2023. Right now we're hitting, if you take the rolling average, we're even 1.7 now. We've had days that are 2.0 and higher, right? So what is it going to take for you to stop talking about possibly maintaining 1.5, right? But I was the new Paul, and I just sort of, gritted my teeth a little bit and grimaced, and So anyway, he's coming around. I think he'll come around. I think in a few years he'll be like the rest of us. But he's got this thing about doomers right now. He's arguing often that, and this really annoys a lot of people that have looked at climate for many years, because he's got this idea that doomers and doomerism is just as bad as denial and disinformation and misinformation, and so he makes a lot of enemies by saying that. But I think I give him a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, because he's stuck in mainstream science, and he's getting better as a communicator. Like, his talk was actually quite good at the Writers' Festival, and he's had enough interviews on radio stations and mainstream news. He's getting better, and he'll come around. Like I told him, I said, I said, when I meet you again in a couple of years, I think you'll be saying, yeah, Hanson's completely right, and models are underestimating things, and yeah, climate change is accelerating, and but he probably won't. It's hard to admit you're wrong. You just kind of modify your view. I mean, the predictions that the Earth is going, we're all going to die by say 2022. That doesn't. If that prediction is made 10 years prior, it's not like the people are going to say, well, I was wrong. It's not 2022. I mean, there's a new number comes out. It's 2024, 2026, whatever. So, there's a lot of uncertainty in the system. There's a lot of unknowns, a lot of surprises. Most of the surprises are on the negative side, unfortunately, and we're running out of time. We're actually really, really close to having having the ocean currents in the North Atlantic just stopping. So the AMOC would completely reconfigure. We wouldn't have the northernmost loop. We wouldn't have all that heat going across from North America over to Europe. Europe temperatures, mean annual temperatures would drop maybe 5 degrees Celsius. Some places like northern Norway would drop up to 20 degrees Celsius. And it would be very difficult to grow food in Europe, and also, the east coast of North America, mostly up in Canada, those temperatures would also drop significantly. I read a paper recently where they said that, this blue ocean event, complete loss of Arctic sea ice in the summers, could have likely occurred had the AMOC not slowed down, 20 to 30%. Okay, so it looks like the AMOC slowing down has been significant enough, if this paper is confirmed by other people and it becomes, sort of well-known textbook type knowledge, then, it's very possible that the reason we haven't had a summer without under 1 million square kilometers of sea ice, a blue ocean event, is because of the AMOC already slowing down. So if you look at, things are definitely changing. There's more flooding around the world right now. That's a huge issue of flooding. I spoke with a friend who does radio EcoShock, Alex Smith, out in British Columbia, Canada, and he said that they had killing frosts in January, which basically have wiped out the grapes in BC, and also has threatened the growing of vegetables, fruit and vegetables in the Annapolis Valley, or the Okanagan Valley. A major food growing region. He said it's basically, food prices are going to go up as a result of this.
Right.
And so we're seeing these things sort of happening around the planet, already right now. These wrenching changes.
Yeah, indeed. Well, and what you were just talking about, the doomers before, and I always have this feeling like if we're in doom, at some point that has to transform into action. And for some people, I think it's a longer time, and for some people, it is a shorter time. We are going to bring on a couple of people. First, Peter Dines, to ask a question or two. Peter Dines is an environmental consultant and currently the managing director at MEER. So Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Kenny. Thanks for hosting as usual. Another brilliant MEER talk, and thanks, Paul, for all that information. There's a lot of information to digest there, as lots of your videos are. But thanks very much for coming along, and thanks for all the work you do as well, Paul, in terms of climate science education online, and your YouTube videos are excellent, and also your language is excellent as well. I like your SOS, your latest one here, trying to get away from the solar radiation management, which seems to scare people. So I quite like that. I mean, we use SRT, which is surface reflection technology, and I quite like climate restoration and phrases like that as well. So we are trying to move away from that too. Now, I'm going to ask you two questions. One was going to be scientific and the other's kind of more of a social question. But the first one was going to be around what tipping point you kind of thought was the most dangerous. But I think you've kind of explained that you probably think the ocean currents and the AMOC is probably your number one on that. So I'm not going to go over that again, because I think you've explained that.
I think that's I mean, that's the one that will have the most impact on people all around the planet. But there are things that we're reaching faster. So I guess the coral reefs, the coral reefs is a huge one. I mean, we're rapidly losing coral reefs. They're going to be gone around the world, in less than a decade. And there's other ocean systems that are even worse than coral reefs, like kelp. The kelp beds, for example, they used to proliferate off the California coastline. In fact, I was fortunate enough to scuba dive on one of these kelp forests, and imagine water 100 feet deep and these huge kelp plants extending from anchored on rocks on the seafloor, extending to the surface with huge fronds, huge leaves, and it's like a complete forest. I mean, it's like a wonderland, and those are gone off. Those ones that I dove on off Catalina Island are gone. California's lost 96% of its kelp forests, and other parts of the world are similarly stressed. I think globally we've lost about 90% of them. In many places, I think maybe the number globally is more like 60 or 70%. Mangroves are greatly stressed on coastlines, as you can imagine, with rising sea levels. But there are new mangroves that are growing in further inland, in other areas. So they're regenerating a bit. And then, of course, seagrasses is another. These are huge carbon sinks, and very important. So there's things that are tipping faster and sooner than the AMOC, but I'd say the AMOC is a huge one. And there's very worrying signs from the autocorrelations and so on with the ocean current. And it's in Antarctica. The sea ice in Antarctica has gone bizarre, actually. Right, it's worrying a lot of scientists, because they thought this might happen, but in 20 or 30 or 40 years, not. And I mean, since 2015, 2016, we might have a blue ocean event in Antarctica before the Arctic. Up until about 2015, Antarctic sea ice was growing about 1.5% every decade, and then it just dropped off the chart. So there's other tipping points, and you can divide them up into things that are more regional and things that are more global as well, right? So I mean, the coral reefs are more regional for coastlines as opposed to affecting all of humans, right? So yeah, but they're all this report, Global Tipping Points by Lenton, the Exeter, it goes into all of these things in great detail. It's heavily referenced. You don't read it at one sitting. It's about 480 pages, the full document. I've done multiple
just
videos.
on that, Paul, just on that point then, because you mentioned the kelp forest, etc., and the same thing is happening off the coast of Spain and Portugal as well, where they're being decimated. So how do you see that as being a possible solution then? Because a lot of people are offering that as a solution, as a carbon drawdown method to increase those using iron fertilization, etc., and to actually increase those type of forests. Well, how is that possible when the existing ones themselves are being decimated?
Yeah, well, the ocean iron fertilization is to restore the base of the food chain, the phytoplankton. Are the very basic part of the marine food chain, and there many areas of the ocean are high in nutrients but low in iron content. So the whole idea is to microseed with iron, and then you can get huge growth of phytoplankton, and then that stimulates the zooplankton and all the way up of the marine food chain. And you can do those sort of things just in the open ocean, right? So we're talking about more when we're talking about coral reefs and kelp beds and seagrasses. Those things are all coastal regions around the planet. So there's also some efforts with kelp. They're trying to see how that they can get hardier strains of the kelp and how they can establish some regions for kelp forests that are further at higher latitudes than the existing ones were. So maybe they can take root and populate coastlines that are higher, further north. But some of these marine heat waves are very extensive. Like the marine heat wave a few years ago off the blob, I guess people were calling it, a few years ago, that was decimating to marine life. So there's lots of, but I think that there is a lot of potential with ocean iron fertilization for sure. And it was actually done by Russ George off the coast of Vancouver. And he got shut down pretty quickly by the Canadian RCMP.
Well, let's hope it can be accelerated, hopefully, and have some impact. And look, I could ask scientific questions all night from you, but other people probably will. I want to ask more of a personal question, because everybody hears from you. You're like a cyborg. You just keep churning out this stuff, constantly educating people on the science. But I kind of want to ask you a more personal question around and how you actually cope with it, because there's a lot of information here. It's very concerning information. We look like we're in an acceleration phase. Things are happening all over the place that we maybe didn't expect. So how personally do you cope with it as a person to absorb all that information and live with it? Many people are living lives that are totally ignorant to any of this, and they're just going about their daily lives. But a lot of people on this call, including yourself, are completely absorbed by it, and you have to deal with it. So I'm just wondering how you cope.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And you don't always cope well with it. Like sometimes it gets to you, and you kind of have to step back a little bit. But I would say that the way I cope with it is to there's so many different topics I can talk about in climate. So if one thing is particularly difficult, then I just go to something totally different in climate, and learn the heck out of it and do a video on it. And I just keep moving on. I just keep moving from one thing to the other. I often sometimes you need to step back and kind of reflect, and let it sink in. But if you just keep moving constantly, then it's one way of coping. Keep generating more and more. So if I'm very prolific for a certain week, that I'm actually struggling with coping with it. And if I'm quiet, you get a video once a week or something, then I'm pretty much calm about it. If I go into a flurry of activity, then it's getting to me, and that's one of the ways. But also I do a lot of reading. It used to be all nonfiction, but now I try to have always a fiction or book on the go as well as a nonfiction book. And I find that helps. And I got a dog 2 years ago, golden doodle, and going on walks in parks. Ottawa's nice. There's lots of walking trails, lots of parks, lots of forested areas just across the river in Gatineau. So being out in nature, walking, is very helpful. And I mean, people can get into cycles where they cope by, alcohol or substance abuse or whatever, but fortunately I stay away from that. I am addicted to playing chess online and bridge online. So if I get really stressed, I might have a marathon chess session on my iPhone. And, it's like rapid games. It's like the game's over in less than 5 minutes. It's like 2 minutes per person. It adds 1 second to move. I am quite a decent chess player. I was ranked in the top 40 in Canada for a while back. I haven't played any tournaments, and I don't play people in person much, but I do, I'm addicted to the damn app on my iPhone. So too much.
All right.
So that's how I try to generally cope with it. But it's always a challenge. You think you never reach a point where you say, okay, I'm completely fine with it. I'm coped. I've succeeded. I can coast. It's not. Life isn't like that, as you know, right? There's always a bit of a struggle sometimes, and that's why it's so hard for people to get over addictions. They think they're over, and then they fall off the wagon for a bit and try again and try again. It's part of human nature, I think. So we just have to be persistent, and don't try to solve everything. You can't solve everything in the world yourself, especially, young people. A lot of young people are getting very concerned, very upset, about the political situation, about, all the stresses, the wars that we're seeing. It's a tough time, but you tell those people, well, you may think it's the worst possible time, but imagine, you're on the brink of World War I and things are going crazy, and it's like people have dealt with really tough times in the past, but it seems like the climate issue kind of transcends that. It seems like, I think we have to recognize that, the climate, the battle for saving our planet is not something that we're not just going to be able to say one day, okay, we've won, we've done it, right? There's always going to be things happening, and it's just a long-term thing, and it's sort of part of the human species. It's part of our civilization, because if we didn't develop fossil fuels, we wouldn't have cities like we have now. We wouldn't have technologies. We wouldn't have our modern day society without doing that. So we've known, of course, of the damages from the 70s and 80s. But 40 years ago, one of the comments was, I think, from Michael Mann. 40 years ago, we didn't really have climate scientists, right? We didn't really see that. We had earth scientists, but we didn't have, so the things are always changing, and we have to, we can't just sort of completely we can completely demonize fossil fuels and say this is the cause of our whole problem, but we have to remember that without that energy source throughout human history, we would be nothing like we are now. Now that could be a great thing, right? If Greenpeace hadn't been so successful, I give them, it's not just Greenpeace, but the nuclear industry was pretty much destroyed. We didn't build new reactors, right? It was completely stopped in its tracks, decades ago. And if that had not happened, we wouldn't be in the crux that we're in right now in terms of fossil fuels. So, this is all water under the bridge, if you like. So, we can demonize fossil fuels all we want, but we wouldn't have anything like what we have today without them throughout history. But I guess
wouldn't be talking to you here.
Yeah,
I wouldn't be talking over the internet. But listen, I better get off, because other people wanted to ask you questions as well, Paul. So thank you very much for your time. It was excellent. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Peter. So we're going to bring on Jamie Shiplet next. And Jamie received her bachelor's in geography and environmental planning from Towson University, where she completed an internship at NASA's DEVELOP program and conducted climatological research on tornadoes and El Nino, the socioeconomic impacts of urban heat island effect, and also the impacts of climate change on viticulture. Jamie has a master's in public administration at the University of San Francisco, where she has focused her academics on climate change policy. And thanks, Jamie, for coming on.
Hi, yeah, Paul, thanks for having us, or thanks for being here and for speaking with us today. As much as the climate interests me, I want to touch on some of the societal challenges you talked about, especially some of the work by Wade Davis. So you mentioned that he believes the Earth is resilient, and I would agree that in some ways it is, but in some ways it's also not. And as you mentioned, positive feedback loops exist, and that further diminishes the Earth's resiliency. Do you have any ideas for initiating negative feedback loops to restore some of the areas where the Earth has either lost resiliency?
Well, I think, yeah, and the report that I'm talking about, it actually covers a lot of, there's a lot of details about these very things. So, I guess obviously the biggest thing is that let's talk about the fossil fuel industry. Okay, so we have to slash fossil fuel emissions, but what if we could do some other things? What if we could block a small fraction of the sunlight coming in on the Earth and restabilize the Earth's climate system, right? Then would we really care so much about the fossil fuels industry having huge emissions if we came up with techniques to take out twice as much as what they're putting up into the atmosphere? So this is, I mean, I'm not so sure that that we would. I mean, I would say that the fossil fuel industry has been. I'm not. It sounds like I'm shilling a bit for them. I'm not. Don't. I mean, you know, they've been evil. I mean, they're destroying the planet and so on. But we think they're. You know, if we were able to come up with techniques so that the planet wasn't being destroyed, you know, then it would give us more time to sort of phase out things. So but I mean, the renewable energy is growing like crazy. Like, we need to really replace our energy supply. We need energy. We're an energy demanding, needing, dependent society completely. You know, we have been since day one, really, since we started burning coal. You know, since at least the Industrial Revolution, we've been completely entwined and interdependent on fossil fuels, and that's why it's so difficult for us to actually get rid of them. I mean, even with the expansion of wind and solar and all of these other alternative sources of energy, the fraction of energy provided by fossil fuels is still about 80%. That number hasn't moved in years. So we're using more and more energy on the planet, and that additional energy that we're using is coming from renewable energy. It's not like we're actually reducing, you know, and the US is the worst of all the countries, right? and arguing, well, we're energy resilient and so on. So you know, people have talked about rewilding, say half of the planet or 40%, right? Taking area, saying these areas are for rewilding, you know, planting new forests. But, you know, if we're going to continue to have heat waves and droughts that are going to kill vast numbers of trees in these forests, then that's not really going to get us out of the problem, right? So we need more people to look at the overall systems. And this is something that we've been very bad at doing. We're a specialized society. We have people studying certain specialized areas, and not enough people thinking about the overall climate system, which is another reason I really like this report on global tipping points, because it takes a big systems approach. There's a whole chapter on governance. You know, what can governments do? Do we need more organizations to look at global effects, to deal with tipping points? You know, it's almost like we need a global organization specifically looking and existing just to look at specific tipping points of the system, because a lot of these things are widespread. They transcend one country's borders, so it's very difficult for us to you know, actually even attack the problem or even discuss it, right? We're just yeah. So governance, there's a whole section on governance. I don't know if I've answered your question, but
I mean, it was more so just about ways to initiate a negative feedback loop to offset the resiliency that was lost in the positive feedback loops.
Okay, well, what I would say, if I was leader of the world, I would ban personal car ownership. Right? I would just say no individual person can purchase an automobile for themselves. And it would have to be quickly replaced by, you know, public transit would get a lot better. We'd start getting things like, you know, we'd have much less traffic on the roads. But, you know, of course, think about the car manufacturers and the lobbyists, you know, and the steel companies, all the companies that are involved in making these cars, they'd all be up in arms against you, right? You know, you'd think you'd be like I mean, this would solve personal transportation is about 45% of emissions, right? So, you know, if you're kind of looking at this from, you know, and not having restrictions on what you can do to solve a problem, you would say, okay, we've got far too many personal automobiles on the planet. You know, what about the cattle? I mean, and the livestock. There's 1.5 billion of those, you know, livestock and cows and cattle on the planet, and they're all producing a lot of methane. So there's some techniques with modifying their feed to reduce their emissions by 45%. But a lot of these livestock and cattle are owned by one family in a country might have one or two of them. So how do you like, they're not all in one place. They're not all owned by the same people. They're distributed. So it's sort of we have to start chipping away at some of these problems. And I think 45% of emissions from personal from cars, basically. So right. So if we want to cut that down, how do we do it? If everybody that owns a car now on the planet replaces that car with an electric car, right? Then do we even have the resources to do that, to build all those batteries and electric cars? Would that actually solve the problem? Because there's a lot of emissions in manufacturing these things, right? So we just need to try to overcome some of our, we have to do some of our thinking about, we have to do something a certain way because that's the way we've always done it.
Yeah. I'd also like to ask you one more question about the different tipping points and how they pertain to each region of the world. So from my perspective, the greed in America and this obsession almost with maintaining global power or authority compared to the rest of the world is its own tipping point. Like, I don't think,
Right.
Yeah, you can only make only so much progress unless people are collaborating, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that this sense of greed and like me versus you that exists in America will be beneficial, say, to other countries in the future, like where that is not so embedded in society?
Yeah, it's America's always been a land of contrast. Like it's always, it's done great things and it's also done horrible things, right? Like one of the things that Wade Davis said is that since 1975, America's been at war with somebody or other, right? I don't know if that's true, but are they at war now? Well, you could argue they're supplying countries at war. But he said that China hasn't been at war at all since then, right? And yet, China is being portrayed as the threat to global peace and the powerhouse and so on. And, the US industry, for example, in World War II, those Liberty ships that they were building, Wade, I'd have to check the stats, but I think he said something like they could build a Liberty ship in about 4 days during the peak of the war. World War II, and they could build, a fighter aircraft like in a day, or multiple ones in a day. So they could tool up and fight that threat. So imagine if 1 year America had this idea. Well, yeah, we're going to lose our global food supply. The world is in horrible trouble. Let's spend all of that money and expertise that are going for military budgets and better ways to kill people more efficiently, and let's put that money on really just not blowing up physically, but blowing up the numbers of solar panels and wind turbines, and let's completely retool to a renewable energy society, and let's capture CO2 out of the atmosphere and do what let's use all those tens of thousands of scientists and engineers that are working for the military industrial complex now and say, we need to save the planet. Like we're going downhill. We're losing our ability. The planet's losing its ability to support us. Right. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Like, so there are huge tipping points that can happen, and until so it just hasn't got bad enough, I guess, for that to happen. To from the U.S. perspective.
Yeah, and I know what you mean. I think also that concept with the greed, like behind it in a way.
Yeah.
There's obviously going to be detrimental consequences in decades, like societal detrimental consequences. But is it enough that things can balance out? I don't know. It's like before it tips itself,
Yeah, I mean you know, some of the stuff that Biden has done with the you know, the money going to renewables and with his you know, recent plans and budgets and things have been, you know, really good. But then they've expanded you know, permits for fossil fuel exploration, you know, for oil, for fracking, right? They've you know, the U.S. has never produced has never produced more oil and gas and coal, you know, combined, more fossil fuels. I mean, we're at they've never produced more than they're doing now, right? They became very dependent on other countries, especially, you know, Saudi Arabia and the Middle Eastern countries for oil, you know, in those crises, the oil crisis, the oil embargo and stuff. And you know, but now today, I mean, they've never produced more. So that's what's happening on the one hand, and then on the other hand, we've got all of these plans for solar and renewables and the environment and so on. So it's like the brain's not connected on both sides in the U.S.
All right. Well, thank you, Jamie, for those questions. And we're going to bring on Dr. Tao now. As many of you probably know, Dr. Tao is the founder and director of MEER.
Hello, Paul. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, and in part because of your wide range of knowledge on all topics, ranging from renewable energies to materials to the history of the world and chess. I forgot that point about you. You must have mentioned when we met in Egypt and also in Glasgow. So I think you're absolutely correct that energy and also the material are what's limiting many of the things that we can do and should have done. And you mentioned that since at least the Industrial Revolution, you know, energy has become such an important ingredient to the functioning of society. And I actually argue that even before that, in agriculture and even hunter-gatherer societies, how much energy you expend versus how much you gather or energy is determined how complex society one you can build. So I think regardless of what type of future we envision, you know, after this fiasco of a period, we must always be thinking in energy return on investment terms, and also the same thinking should be applied to dealing with the climate crisis. For example, there is a blind pursuit almost for carbon mitigation. But if we take into account energy availability and also the size of the global warming problem in energy terms, one quickly comes to the realization that none of the proposed carbon capture schemes even comes to within 1 or 2 orders of magnitude in efficiency compared to the minimum threshold that's needed to tackle the problem. So I think I really appreciate you bringing in this energy and material perspective. And you mentioned the nuclear, which I think is an interesting thought experiment. But there are some people argue that, for example, Nate Higgins and others who study these things for a living, that when you have excess energy, a system that's designed to maximize output will just use that as extra input and thereby increase the turnover of the whole system. And as a side consequence, you may even hasten the exploitation of fossil fuels, just you make it the whole dissipation process much faster. So, and I think it's called the Jevons paradox, I think, in the field.
Yes.
So I'm not so convinced that ramping up nuclear was a good thing. Of course, that's up to scholarly debate. But I think back to the main point of this presentation, it seems to me that you believe that AMOC is the most crucial one. And if we can stop that, that'll be go a long way towards buying us time for stopping all the others and preventing the loss of agricultural habitats for Northern Europe and certainly slowing down the melting of the Western Hemisphere. So you mentioned some of the signatures that's been used to project the collapse are based on increasing autocorrelation function as function of time as the delay between the 2 time series, or its own time series. I'm not in the field, but I remember also seeing like temperature anomaly in the northern part of the Atlantic, and a positive temperature anomaly like American, Canadian East Coast as also a potential signature, because the argument is that if you have a slower transport of heat, there's more heat stuck to the southern part less heat is transported in up north, so it becomes colder up north if there's a slowdown of
Yes.
the flow of the river, let's say. But then recently, there's this sulfate aerosol business, which corresponds to the exact same region. So have people done studies on deconvolving these two effects? So how much of the cooling anomaly in that, what corresponds to the northern shipping line, is actually, could that be fully attributed to the sulfate cooling? And what's your projection of what would happen if that region starts to be warmed up by the solar light and more evaporation happens, and then the ocean becomes more dense because the salt content goes up? Would we have a restoration of the AMOC as a result of this?
Yeah, it's great questions. I think the first thing really is the energy of the energy that humans have used and required. I mean, we've used more and more over time, and our effects on the climate. I mean, people are arguing, is this the Anthropocene? Or, and I have to laugh a bit, because if you've read some of Bill Ruddiman's work on, he argues that humans changed the climate of 5,000 years ago on the planet. When we went from hunter-gatherers to agriculture, right? He says that we warmed, his arguments are that we basically warmed the planet maybe almost up to a degree, from that time with our actions, all inadvertent, of course. I guess you think that we would have evolved enough in our knowledge and our science and that we got to stop doing things inadvertently, I guess, is the key thing, right? Like we should know enough that we can do a lot of things today to help the situation, and do less things that are inadvertent, unexpected, right? Because but no, that doesn't seem to be the case. The International Maritime Organization, without advice from climate scientists or anybody else, said, well, the sulfur going up into the air is causing air pollution, right? They estimate that they've said that 100,000 people fewer people have died from air pollution related ailments, since those emissions were cut in 2015 initially, right? And they cut them more in 2020, but they seem to be oblivious to, hey, this could cause a huge warming over the whole northern hemisphere, which is what Hansen is claiming, and that's what Michael Mann is disagreeing with. And there has been a few papers in support of Hansen since he wrote his initial papers, Global Warming in the Pipeline. So there's more and more research being done on this, but this is sort of something that you kind of wonder, well, why didn't we think about this before, right? Like, do we need to tell the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, put the sulfur back in? You took it out too quickly, right? Or we could replace the sulfur that the ships were putting in from their funnels. We could put that in intentionally to bring back those clouds and cool the ocean and slow down the warming. But would that be done? Then it's geoengineering, right? You know what I'm saying? The arguments are kind of like, well, isn't it geoengineering that the IMO took the sulfur out of the shipping fuels because it's been in there for 30 or 40 years and it's been cooling the northern hemisphere, right? So this is we've got to stop. We've got to start thinking more of the system picture. Now, in terms of the AMOC and why it's so important to the whole planet is, it's really about the distribution of heat between the northern and southern hemispheres, because the AMOC brings so much heat up to to Europe, right? If you look at the latitude of Europe, it would be much colder without that heat from the ocean current. So I talked already about how most people still think that, okay, Europe would get a lot colder, Eastern Canada would get colder, but what about the rest of the northern hemisphere, right? Like and then I read the paper that, well, we probably would have lost sea ice in the Arctic already, and we would have had much more glacier melt on Greenland, and but because the AMOC slowed down that 20 or 30% already, we still have sea ice there on a seasonal basis, and it would have been way worse if the AMOC hadn't been slowing down. So it's compensating already, according to this paper. The big thing about if you're not moving all that heat to the northern hemisphere, which is what the ocean currents are currently doing, then that heat doesn't just disappear. It has to go somewhere. So it heats up the equatorial regions much more, and it heats up the southern hemisphere a lot more if it's not going north. Now, if it heats up the equatorial regions, then that completely changes the monsoon systems, which billions of people, literally billions of people, rely on for their food systems, right? So the area called the intertropical convergence zone, where a very heavily rainfall region near the equator, that sort of represents the balancing of temperatures between the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere. So if the northern hemisphere gets a lot colder and the southern hemisphere gets warmer, the ITCZ shifts southward, and therefore the monsoon patterns change completely, in the tropics. So and this has an impact like on literally billions of people, in China and India, those monsoons failing, and there's more and more heat in the southern hemisphere. So this is why, it seems like it's got such a, if you look at there's many good illustrations in this report by Lenton, the Exeter report, and that try to tie in the different systems. There's a whole chapter, I believe, on cascading and domino effects. Like if one thing happens, that can lead to another thing and another thing, like a chain reaction, if you like. And it seemed to me that, if you just look at the diagrams at all of the tipping points and there's lines connecting them, if something happens here, then something else will happen. I mean, the AMOC, if you want to preserve ice on Greenland and preserve the sea ice in the Arctic, then the AMOC weakening even more is the best thing that can happen, right, for those systems. The problem is it affects everything, humans a lot more by, say, shifting the monsoon out of where it is right now, so billions of people don't get enough food. So this is a whole system thinking, right? The whole system is so tied together. And as far as the Jevons paradox, yeah, I mean, we tend to, I mean, you can look at what's happening today with the growth of AI, right? A few years ago, it was cryptocurrency, and then the amount of energy to run these cryptocurrency schemes was higher than many countries' output of energy, right? And now AI, it can be doing the same thing. So we have to be smart about AI. We have to use AI to help us solve our issues and problems, and not to use so much energy that it makes things worse, right? So I guess there's more questions, a lot more questions than answers. That's for sure.
All right, thank you very much. I will leave the floor to other viewers and people in the audience.
Yeah,
thank you.
Well, great to see you. I'll have to see you at a COP again soon. Or
Thank you, Dr. Tao. Yeah, we do have a few questions that have come in, and then we'll wrap up. So here's a question from Jonathan. Given that the world's economy is addicted to fossil fuels, their use is growing, and forests and other carbon sinks are becoming sources as methane emissions grow and all of that. Would you agree that it's reasonable to objectively plan for a concentration of 1,000 ppm before any level off or decline is likely?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think if we get 1,000 ppm, I don't think there'll be so many people on the planet to see that, actually, because a lot of things are going to happen much before then, right? I mean, we talk about, and also I guess you're talking about CO2 equivalent probably with that question, because if we just talk about pure CO2 levels, I mean, we were at 280 before the Industrial Revolution. The Earth is varied between 180 and well, between about 200 and 300 roughly, or 180 and 280 parts per million through the glacial cycles. You know, of course, we far exceeded that. You know, methane's risen even faster, you know, much higher rates. It starts off, you know, in parts per billion rather than parts per million, but it's much higher. Nitrous oxide also rapidly increasing. You know, industrial processes are using things like sulfur hexafluoride and some other things, which are, you know, I think the global warming potential of SF6 is like, it's thousands to tens of thousands even. So, you know, just a few molecules of that has huge warming. So we're, you know, we're rapidly going up with you know, and if you talk about the CO2 equivalent, it's using the global warming potential of the particular greenhouse gas, you know, along with the concentration to come up with an equivalent number if it was all CO2. And those numbers are, you know, maybe that's your 1,000 number, which is even well over double what we are today. So it's hard to say, because I think the likely thing, what my best guess would be, we're heading on a path where we're going to break some really key parts of our civilization system. So, and I think we're going to break the global food supply. Okay, so I would say, you know, things will worsen, you know, 5 or 10 years, maybe we'll have, you know, one of these patterns of jet streams where we lose a lot of our ability to grow food in the Northern Hemisphere in multiple locations. So we'll have global food shortages and a crisis for that. And then, you know, maybe that will wake enough people up in governments to say that the absolute top priority is trying to stabilize the climate system. And I think we can do that with some of these SOS methods that I've been talking about.
Yeah.
And you know, we'll make a lot of mistakes, but I think I don't think we'll have any options. We'll be trying to preserve what we can. And then you know, it's really hard to make any predictions on, you know, on specific details, but I think that's sort of the general layout of what I would see happening. You know, that's subject to change. I mean, with new stuff I learn and read and so on, I might, you know, completely, you know, have a different view, and I hopefully not in a week or a month, but maybe in a year or two.
Right. Well, here's a question from Roger, and it's about what you call SOS or geoengineering. Roger worries about this and thinks we do not sufficiently understand the science to avoid unintended damaging consequences from unknown tipping points. And you've said, yeah, we'll make some mistakes. And so Roger says, I worry about what agency decides for the entire world. Can you please respond to my concerns?
Yeah, I mean, that's there's a lot of most of mainstream scientists and people, most people are on the planet are saying, no, we absolutely cannot go there to, in quotes, geoengineering, right? Just a few years ago, you know, just a few years ago, the governmental bodies, the UN, et cetera, was saying slashing fossil fuels is the only thing that we can do. We can't pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. We can't talk about dimming the sunlight by 1% to cooling the planet and stabilizing it. We can't talk about any of these other things. In fact, scientists that tried to do some experiments, they were going to spray water out of nozzles on a balloon up in the stratosphere. It's called the SPICE experiment. You know, that was shut down. It was just too controversial. So we haven't literally been able to do anything and done anything in the atmosphere, you know, towards the solar radiation management techniques. But the UN bodies and governments around the world, their models and their projections going forward are completely dependent on us being able to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Like they talk about net zero. Well, net zero, they talk about that all the time. Well, that's net zero it's emissions minus what we can take out of the atmosphere. right? So even though they were completely against any carbon removal just a few years ago, they're all assuming it's going to be done now. And they don't talk about it that much, but that's what net zero means, right? So I think, as things worsen, and I think, obviously I think a global food shortage due to climate change, would be a big enough, disruption to human society that we would say, okay, what can we do about these other things? So maybe we should be studying all these other things. Maybe we should be putting huge resources rather than have the day when the world is starving and say, okay, what can we do now? Well, we didn't study it. So then we're in trouble, right? Because we start deploying things that aren't studied when we could have, studied them for a decade.
Mm-hmm.
And figured out what would work, what wouldn't work. And it's not all or nothing. You start small scale stuff. I mean, the termination shock is something that people are really worried about. They're saying, let's say we put aerosols up into the stratosphere. We cool the planet, everything's working fine. But then we stop, well, then the warming will go huge, right? And we'll be, well, if the warming is going to be huge anyway, not doing anything, right? So then that argument isn't really valid, right? Like the thing is we always have to weigh the risks of doing these things versus not doing them.
Mm-hmm.
So, the shipping fuels is a perfect example, right? That was just done, taking sulfur out of shipping fuels. There was no discussion. There were no videos. There was no UN group saying, should we do this or not? The company in charge decided, the group in charge, the International Maritime Organization, said, hey, we have the technology now. We don't need the sulfur in the fuels. Let's just remove it, regulate low percentage, 3.5%, 9% down to 3.5%, down to 0.5%. The first regulation was in 2015. And then the tightened one was in 2020. Let's do it. And then what happens? The oceans are warmer by 4 or 5 standard deviations in large parts of the North Atlantic, other parts of the Pacific, Northern Hemisphere. Changes the global warming rate, changes everything. Well, there was no committee deciding this. So we've got to, take stock of what we're doing that's affecting the planet. Mm-hmm. And if not just let some organization say, okay, let's take the shipping. I mean, that's a geoengineering company, if you like, or organization. They're geoengineering the planet by removing sulfur from the shipping fuels that have been in there for 40 years, and they caused huge, tremendous warming.
Yeah.
Right. Isn't there an outcry about that? Like,
right. The rate of heating does matter because it matters for how many life forms die, whether it's all life forms, whether it's some life forms, just humanity and some life forms on the planet. Okay, well, I think we are going to end with just one final question. This one's from Arthur. Should we acknowledge, it seems, that tipping points will be reached and that social collapse is more realistic than many scientists and technologists say? Is that, shall we just agree this is what's going to happen, and, act from that?
Yeah. The short answer is yes. I mean, and I think people know. I mean, most people are aware of coral reefs, for example, right? So that's definitely, a tipping point. The water, they're fine. The water just gets slightly too warm, crosses their threshold. The whole reef collapses. It's replaced by algae. Instead of the colorful coral, you get algae. So the reefs, it's hard to see on space. You look at a reef, you can see this dark area. Then the coral dies, it bleaches, turns white, algae regrows, and it looks similar from space to a healthy reef, right? It's got that darkish color. Meanwhile, the reef is gone, and then over time, the coral just wears away and erodes away, and eventually you just have sand where the reef used to be. And for a reef to rebuild there, it can take tens, thousands, 100,000 years even. Right. So, the kelp beds off the Catalinas, for example, prolific, huge sources of carbon, huge shelters for fish, huge proliferation of marine life. And those kelp beds are no longer there. Right. So we're reaching tipping in all of these different regions. So I like the outline of this report because it talks about a lot of these issues about governance and about trying to look at the early warning signals that we're seeing and address them on a global view. It transcends, most of these things transcend many borders of different countries. Some of them don't, right? Some of them are just internal to a country, but then if it happens, like if Brazil loses its rainforest, that's a catastrophe for Brazil, but it's actually a catastrophe for the world because the CO2 levels, greenhouse gas levels go way up in the atmosphere, right? We lose a huge carbon sink.
Yeah.
So there's all different scales and levels on just time scales and spatial scales of all of these things. And these all come from looking at the Earth from a systems point of view. And we're part of the system. And what we do on a large scale collectively can actually impact the whole system as well within, in positive ways and in negative ways. And we're doing things that are having huge negative effects on the climate, and we don't even discuss or realize them, like sulfur removal from shipping fuels, for example. Right? So we've got to recognize everything that humans are doing, and if we bring in some regulation on one thing, well, how is it going to ripple through and affect the system, right? So we need to be, we need to get smarter on these things. There's no excuses anymore.
Indeed. Well, this has been really great to have you. And I want to remind people, Paul Beckwith has a YouTube channel. You can look him up. And also Global Tipping Points. We can all read 500 pages if we can, or 480. If you Google Global Tipping Points, I think it's global-tipping-points.org has something. Am I right about that?
Yeah, yes, that's right.
Yeah. So thank you, Paul. Yeah. Thank you for helping us further our climate education here.
Well, thank you for having me.
At MEER, we're working to help educate the public while also developing a solution to the warming on the planet. We invite you to keep learning about Earth's energy imbalance and climate science on our website. We're a mostly volunteer staff, so please consider making a monthly donation of any amount if you've enjoyed being here or if you've gained from it. And you can check our MEERTALKs out on our YouTube channel. You can also hear our podcast. I encourage you to check out our podcast, go to our website, and there are links to that on our resources page with Peter Dines hosting Dr. Tao, who talks about, the projects and a lot of really interesting things. So encourage you to check out the podcast. And you can find us on social media. If you have found being here beneficial in some way, informative, please tell somebody else about MEERTALK. And we hope to see you again next month. It will be Sunday, June 2nd. Until then, take care, everybody. Thanks for coming.